January 17th, 1943. Tunisia, North Africa. Dawn. The air tasted of diesel and dust. Along the jagged ridgeline overlooking the Kasserine Pass, Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann pressed his eye against the rubber cup of his binoculars, scanning the valley below where morning mist clung to the wadis like a pale shroud. The cold metal of his carabiner 98K rifle bit into his shoulder as he shifted position. Behind him, dug into the rocky hillside, a PaK-40 anti-tank gun crew waited in silence, their breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn chill. Zimmermann had been at Stalingrad. He had seen the Ivans throw wave after wave of T-34s against German positions until the snow turned black with oil and red with blood. He knew tanks. He knew how to kill them. But what rolled toward him now, emerging from the dissipating fog like iron ghosts, was something his training films had barely mentioned. The Americans were coming, and they were bringing their Shermans. The sound reached him first, not the high-pitched whine of a Panzer transmission, but a deeper, steadier rumble. Mechanical? Industrial. Relentless. Through his binoculars, Zimmermann counted them. 5, 8, 12. More appearing from the morning haze. Medium tanks, he thought. Nothing compared to a Tiger. Nothing to fear. The intelligence reports had said as much. The M4 Sherman was adequate at best, inferior to German armor in every measurable way. Thinner armor, weaker gun, a petrol engine that burned like a torch when punctured. The Lancer had already given it a nickname, Tommy Coker, the Tommy Cooker, a steel coffin on tracks. Zimmermann lowered his binoculars and allowed himself a thin smile. The Americans were rich, yes. They had factories that churned out machines like sausages from a grinder. But wars were not won by quantity alone. They were won by superior engineering, tactical brilliance, and the fighting spirit of men who understood sacrifice. The Sherman, he had been assured, was proof that American industrial might could not compensate for German military excellence. Within the hour, Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann would learn that nearly everything he believed about the Sherman tank, about American military capability, and about the inevitable triumph of the Wehrmacht was a carefully constructed lie that would shatter as completely as the defensive position he now occupied. For the German soldiers stationed in North Africa in early 1943, the war still felt winnable. Rommel's Afrika Korps had become legendary, a force that had pushed the British to the edge of collapse at El Alamein and transformed desert warfare into an art form. The arrival of American forces in Operation Torch had been noted with interest but not alarm. Americans were untested, their equipment untried in the furnace of real combat. The Sherman tank seemed to confirm every preconception. It was a mass-produced compromise, designed by a nation that valued production speed over battlefield superiority. The specifications supported this view. The standard M4 Sherman carried a 75mm gun that struggled against the frontal armor of Germany's newer tanks. Its own armor, barely 50mm at the front, could be penetrated by most German anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. It stood taller than German panzers, making it an easier target. Its gasoline engine was a notorious fire hazard, especially compared to the diesel engines of Soviet armor. German tank crews had faced T-34s that could absorb punishment and keep fighting. They had crewed Panthers and Tigers that could destroy enemy armor from ranges where return fire was impossible. The Sherman appeared to be neither as resilient as Russian tanks nor as lethal as German ones, but the Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had analyzed the Sherman as if it were a German tank produced by German doctrine for German tactical purposes. They had measured it against the Panther and found it wanting, measured it against the Tiger and declared it inferior. What they failed to understand was that the Sherman was never intended to be a Panther. It was not designed to fight in the same way, and it was not produced according to the same philosophy. The Sherman was the mechanical embodiment of American industrial democracy, a weapon that gained its strength not from individual superiority, but from overwhelming, coordinated mass, not from technical perfection, but from reliability, adaptability, and the logistical miracle that could place it anywhere in the world, fully supplied, fully maintained, and ready to fight. The M4 Sherman could be produced at a rate that German factories could not match. In 1943 alone, American industry would manufacture over 21,000 Sherman tanks. Germany, straining every resource, would produce approximately 6,000 tanks of all types that same year. More crucially, the Sherman could cross an ocean on a cargo ship, be unloaded at a North African port, receive fuel and ammunition from a supply chain that stretched back to factories in Detroit and Cleveland, and drive into combat with a crew that had been trained on identical machines back in Fort Knox or Fort Benning. When a Sherman was damaged, spare parts arrived within days. When a crew member was wounded, a replacement who knew the tank's systems would be integrated immediately. The Sherman was not a weapon. It was a weapon system, embedded in a larger machine of war that German planners had fundamentally failed to comprehend. As dawn broke fully over Kasserine Pass on that January morning, this conceptual gap was about to become lethally apparent. The first shells from the Pak-40 guns struck home with textbook precision. Zimmerman watched through his binoculars as armor-piercing rounds impacted the lead Sherman at a range of 800 meters. Sparks flew. The tank shuddered. He waited for the catastrophic explosion, the gout of flame, the panicked crew bailing out. Instead, the Sherman slowed, traversed its turret with mechanical precision, and fired back. The high-explosive shell missed the Pak-40 position by mere meters, showering the crew with rock fragments and forcing them to duck. When Zimmerman looked again, the Sherman was moving forward, still advancing. The second and third Shermans spread out in textbook formation, supporting one another, their guns seeking targets with practiced coordination. The Pak-40 fired again. Another hit, this time on the second tank. Again, the Sherman absorbed the punishment. A section of track flew off, and the tank ground to a halt, but its turret remained operational, laying suppressive fire on the German position while the other Shermans maneuvered around it. Zimmerman felt the first cold thread of doubt wind through his gut. These tanks were not behaving like the intelligence reports had promised. They were not breaking down. They were not retreating under fire. They were adapting. What Klaus Zimmermann could not know, pinned in his rocky position as shells turned his world into shrieking chaos, was that he was witnessing the execution of combined arms doctrine refined through 2 years of British experience and adapted with American pragmatism. The Shermans were not charging blindly. They advanced with infantry support. Zimmerman could see the olive-drab figures now, moving in short rushes between rocks, suppressing German positions with rifle and machine gun fire. Artillery fire began to fall on the German positions, called in by forward observers moving with the tank columns. And above, though Zimmerman could not yet see them through the smoke and dust, American P-40 fighters were stacking up, ready to dive on any German armor foolish enough to reveal itself. The Sherman's gun was adequate, not exceptional. But adequacy delivered in overwhelming quantity, coordinated with air support, artillery, and infantry, became something else entirely. The German defensive position at Kasserine had been designed to stop tanks through positioning and concentrated anti-tank fire, the same doctrine that had worked against British Crusaders and Grants. But the Americans were not fighting tank against tank. They were fighting system against position, and they had the resources to feed that system until resistance collapsed. A fourth Sherman crested the ridgeline to Zimmerman's left, having circled around the POC 40 kill zone. Its machine guns raked the German positions. Men screamed. Someone shouted orders that were lost in the mechanical roar. The POC 40 crew tried to traverse their gun, but a high-explosive shell landed directly in their position, silencing them permanently. Zimmerman pressed himself into the rocks, fingers digging into the sand, as the Iron Giants rolled past his position, barely 10 meters away. He could feel the vibration through the ground, a rhythmic pounding like the heartbeat of some vast industrial beast. The closest Sherman's tracks were wider than he expected, distributing weight across soft terrain that had bogged down earlier German attacks. Its engine note was steady. None of the temperamental whine of a Maybach transmission pushed to its limits. And painted on its side, barely visible through the dust, was a white star and the words Spirit of Steed. Lewis, in fresh paint. The Americans had named their tanks, as if they were ships, as if they had so many that each one could carry its own identity. The Shermans rolled through the German position and continued advancing. Behind them came half-tracks filled with infantry, jeeps towing anti-tank guns, and trucks, endless trucks, carrying ammunition, fuel, rations, spare parts. Zimmerman watched from his hiding place as this mechanical river flowed past, and the cold thread of doubt became a knot of certainty. Germany was not fighting a tank. Germany was fighting an economy, and that economy had just arrived in North Africa with a fury that made Rommel's logistics struggles look like the desperate improvisation they had always been. The Battle of Kasserine Pass would become known as an American defeat, a bloody nose delivered by German forces under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim that sent green American troops reeling backward. But veterans of the Afrika Korps who survived the subsequent campaigns would remember Kasserine differently. They would remember it as the moment they first encountered not just American armor, but the American way of war. A way that did not depend on individual technical superiority or tactical genius, but on the systematic application of resources that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Lieutenant Erich Hartmann, commander of a Panzer IV in the 21st Panzer Division, wrote in his diary after engaging American forces in March 1943, "We knocked out 6 of their Shermans today, and felt we had won a victory. Tomorrow, they will have 12 more. We lost 1 Panzer IV and cannot replace it. The mathematics of this equation require no genius to solve." Hartmann's observation cut to the heart of the Sherman's real power. In a war where Germany struggled to replace combat losses, where every tank destroyed was an irreplaceable drain on limited industrial capacity and even more limited fuel reserves, the Americans could absorb losses that would cripple a Wehrmacht division and return to combat strength within days. The Sherman's mechanical reliability proved equally decisive. German tankers had learned to husband their machines, nursing temperamental transmissions and conserving fuel that might not be replaced. Panther tanks spent nearly as much time undergoing repairs as in combat. Tiger tanks, while fearsome when operational, required extensive maintenance and consumed fuel at rates that North African logistics could not support. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed for operation by average crews under harsh conditions with minimal maintenance. Its radial aircraft engine, while less powerful than German designs, was reliable and easy to repair. Its wide tracks and relatively light weight gave it mobility across terrain that bogged down heavier German armor. And perhaps most importantly, it could be repaired in the field using standardized parts that arrived through supply chains of staggering efficiency. A Sherman crew that knocked out a Panzer and lost their own tank could be assigned a replacement vehicle within days and return to combat with minimal retraining. A German crew that lost their Panzer IV might wait weeks for a replacement that would never arrive, or find themselves reassigned to infantry duties as Germany's armor reserves dwindled. The psychological impact of this disparity was profound. German tankers learned to fear not the Sherman itself, but the inevitability it represented. No matter how many they destroyed, more would appear. No matter how brilliantly they fought, American industrial capacity would grind them down through sheer weight of metal. By the summer of 1943, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Sicily, the Sherman had evolved. The M4A1 variant, with improved armor and the more powerful 76mm gun, began reaching front-line units. But even the standard 75mm Sherman had proven devastating in the hands of crews who understood its strengths. The tank's relatively low profile compared to its early reputation, combined with excellent optics and a gyroscopic stabilizer that allowed accurate fire while moving, a feature no German tank possessed, made it a formidable opponent when properly employed. In the tangled hedgerows of Normandy and the rubble-strewn streets of French and German cities, the Sherman's reliability and infantry support capabilities would prove more valuable than the raw armor and firepower of German heavy tanks that could not maneuver, could not be supplied, and could not be replaced. Hauptmann Wilhelm Richter first saw a Sherman's interior in July 1944, outside the Norman town of Caen. His Panther tank had been immobilized by a track strike, and he and his crew abandoned it under heavy artillery fire, sprinting through a wheat field as shells transformed the world into fountains of earth and shrapnel. They stumbled into an American tank position. 3 Shermans parked in a small orchard, their crews eating from cans and smoking cigarettes, while mechanics worked on one tank's suspension. Richter and his men surrendered without resistance, too exhausted and shell-shocked to consider anything else. What struck Richter, in the surreal calm that followed his capture, was the casualness of it all. The American tankers did not seem to treat their Shermans with the reverence German crews had learned to show their machines. These were not temperamental weapons that required constant vigilance and care. They were tools. One Sherman had a pin-up girl painted on its turret. Another carried extra fuel cans strapped to the back with casual disregard for the fire hazard. The crews were young, shockingly young, and they talked about their tanks the way factory workers might discuss drill presses or lathes. Functional, replaceable. A sergeant allowed Richter to look inside one Sherman's turret while they waited for the MPs to arrive. The interior was cramped, but logically organized. Every control had a clear purpose and placement. The periscope optics were excellent, better than those in Richter's Panther. Radio equipment was modern and clearly standardized. What astonished Richter most were the small details. Rubber padding on sharp edges to prevent injury during movement. A small electric light that could be turned on without affecting night vision. Holders for ammunition designed to prevent the kind of catastrophic brew-up that had killed so many German tankers when a penetrating shot ignited stored shells. These were not the design choices of engineers trying to create a superweapon. These were the choices of engineers who assumed their machines would be crewed by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, and who had designed every element to keep those men alive and fighting. The sergeant offered Richter a cigarette, American, smooth and mild compared to the harsh German tobacco when tobacco could be found at all, and commented in broken German that the Sherman was a good enough tank, not fancy, but it gets the job done. Richter nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He thought of his Panther, now abandoned in the wheat field, a magnificent machine when it ran, but plagued by transmission failures and fuel consumption that German logistics could no longer support. He thought of the endless debates among German tankers about the superiority of German engineering, the sophisticated optics and armor schemes, and powerful guns that made each panzer a work of mechanical art. And he thought of the terrible simplicity of the American approach. Build a tank that works, build 10,000 of them, and keep building until the enemy runs out of ammunition, fuel, or will. The symbolic weight of the Sherman extended beyond its mechanical capabilities. To German soldiers facing them, each tank represented not just American military power, but American industrial abundance, a nation that could afford to ship hundreds of tons of steel across an ocean, maintain complex supply chains thousands of miles long, and replace combat losses at rates that made German logistics officers weep with envy. The tank became a rolling embodiment of the democracy it served. Not perfect, not individually superior, but effective through mass coordination and the systematic application of resources that gave every crew a fighting chance. German propaganda tried to counter the psychological impact. Newsreels showed Tigers destroying Shermans at long range. Training films emphasized the Tommy Cooker reputation, the Sherman's vulnerability to the German 88mm gun, the superior armor protection of German designs. But soldiers who actually faced Shermans in combat learned different lessons. They learned that American tanks did not attack alone, but as part of a combined arms team that included artillery, air support, and well-equipped infantry. They learned that destroying one Sherman accomplished little when 3 more appeared the next day. They learned that the American crews improved rapidly, that green troops at Kasserine had become hardened veterans by the Bulge, and that American tactical doctrine evolved to exploit the Sherman's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. In the Ardennes Forest in December 1944, during Germany's last major offensive in the West, Shermans played a critical role in blunting the German advance. Outnumbered and often outgunned by the heavy German armor thrown into the Battle of the Bulge, Sherman crews held positions through determination and the knowledge that relief, resupply, and reinforcement were always coming. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces were sustained by aerial supply drops that included fuel and ammunition for their Shermans. The same logistical system that could ship a complete tank from Detroit to Normandy could drop thousands of pounds of supplies from C-47 transports, keeping isolated units fighting when German forces, at the end of their supply lines and low on fuel, ground to a halt. Oberstleutnant Ernst Fischer, captured in the Ardennes, later reflected on this disparity in his interrogation. We spoke of German quality versus American quantity, as if these were opposing virtues. We were wrong. The Americans had discovered that quantity, properly organized and sustained, becomes its own quality. Their Sherman was not the best tank on the battlefield, but it was the most reliable, the most numerous, and backed by resources we could not match. In the end, that was what mattered. The mechanics of the Sherman's gun spoke to this philosophy. The 75mm M3 gun, mounted in most Shermans until late 1944, was not designed to destroy heavy German armor from the front. It could not reliably penetrate a Tiger or Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges. But it excelled at supporting infantry, destroying fortifications, and engaging the lighter German armor that comprised the majority of Wehrmacht tank strength. The 75mm high-explosive round was devastating against infantry positions, anti-tank guns, and the various support vehicles that comprised most of a German armored division's strength. Sherman crews learned to maneuver for flank shots against heavy armor while using their superior numbers to overwhelm German positions. Where German doctrine emphasized the decisive engagement between individual tanks, American doctrine treated the tank as one element in a combined arms team designed to destroy the enemy's entire tactical system. When the 76mm gun was introduced in the M4A3E8 Easy 8 variant, giving the Sherman genuine anti-armor capability against all but the heaviest German tanks, it completed the weapon's evolution into a truly multi-role platform. But even then, the Sherman's greatest strength remained what it had always been: availability. A good tank that could be everywhere, supplied by a logistics system of unprecedented scope, crewed by adequately trained men who could be replaced and reinforced, proved more valuable than a technically superior weapon that could only be deployed in limited numbers with uncertain supply. The diesel engine of later Sherman variants, the M4A2 primarily supplied to Soviet forces and the British under Lend-Lease, reduced the fire risk that had plagued gasoline-powered models and improved fuel efficiency. Soviet crews praised the Sherman's reliability in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, where T-34s were more powerful, but the American tanks' superior optics, ergonomics, and crew comfort allowed Soviet tankers to fight longer and more effectively. The Sherman served in the Red Army alongside the T-34, and Soviet after-action reports noted the American tank's mechanical reliability and ease of maintenance as significant advantages, even as they acknowledged the T-34's superior armor and gun. By war's end, more than 49,000 Sherman tanks had been produced in various configurations. They served on every front, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, from the steppes of Russia to the streets of Manila. No other tank of World War II was as widely produced or as globally deployed. The Sherman became the mechanical backbone of Allied armored forces, a common platform that allowed for standardized training, simplified logistics, and the kind of coordinated operations that characterized Allied military success. In the rubble of Berlin in May 1945, a column of Soviet T-34s and American-supplied Shermans rolled past the Reichstag, symbols of the alliance that had crushed Nazi Germany. German soldiers who witnessed this final parade saw the Sherman in a new context, not as an individual weapon to be compared against the Panther or Tiger, but as the embodiment of a war-making capacity that had proven unstoppable. Each Sherman represented factories that ran 3 shifts, supply chains that spanned oceans, an economy that could sustain total war while raising living standards at home, and a democratic system that had mobilized its industrial might for a common purpose. General Major Otto Schmidt, who had commanded armor on both the Eastern and Western fronts and survived to see Germany's surrender, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "We spent the war building better tanks. The Americans spent the war building more tanks. History has judged which approach was correct. The Sherman was never the finest tank on the battlefield, but it was the tank that won the war, and that is the only measure that matters. We sought perfection. They sought sufficiency backed by abundance. In war, as in so much else, perfection is the enemy of good enough." The Sherman's legacy extended beyond its direct combat effectiveness. It established principles of weapons design that would influence military thinking for decades. The value of reliability over peak performance, the importance of maintainability in field conditions, the necessity of standardization in a coalition war, and above all, the understanding that the best weapon is the one that can be produced in sufficient numbers, deployed where needed, and sustained in combat by logistics that never fail. Modern militaries still grapple with these trade-offs, balancing the desire for technically superior systems against the practical need for weapons that can be built, maintained, and sustained at scale. The sun set over the Elbe River on a warm evening in May 1945, casting long shadows across the Sherman tank that sat, engine idling, at the link-up point where American and Soviet forces had met and effectively cut Germany in two. The tank's white star was faded, its olive paint scratched and scorched from months of combat. On its turret, someone had chalked "Berlin" or "Bust" in crooked letters that rain had smudged but not erased. The crew, none older than 23, all veterans of campaigns that had carried them from Normandy through the Siegfried Line and into the heart of the Reich, sat on the tank's deck, sharing rations with Soviet tankers whose T-34 was parked nearby. These young men understood, in a way that intelligence officers and historians would spend decades analyzing, what the Sherman truly represented. It was not a superweapon. It had not won battles through technical superiority or brilliant individual design. It had won through persistence, through the steady accumulation of small advantages, through the knowledge that every destroyed tank would be replaced. Every wounded crew member would be evacuated and treated with the best medical care industrial civilization could provide, and every advance would be supported by logistics of staggering complexity and reliability. The Sherman was democracy made mechanical, imperfect, pragmatic, capable of absorbing punishment and adapting to circumstances, deriving strength not from inherent superiority, but from the coordinated efforts of millions of workers, engineers, soldiers, and citizens who had contributed to its creation and deployment. Where totalitarian powers had sought to win through the perfection of superweapons and the ruthless exploitation of conquered territories, the Allied powers, and America most of all, had won through the systematic application of resources, the efficiency of democratic capitalism, and a logistics system that could project power across the globe while maintaining public support at home. Klaus Zimmermann, who had survived the war and sat now in a POW camp waiting for processing and eventual return to what remained of Germany, thought often of that January morning at Kasserine Pass when he had first seen Shermans emerging from the fog. He had spent the war learning that everything he had been taught about German superiority was a lie, not because German engineering was inferior, but because engineering alone could not win a war against an enemy that could outproduce, outlast, and ultimately overwhelm through sheer material abundance backed by political will. The Sherman had been adequate. That adequacy, multiplied by tens of thousands and sustained by American industrial might, had been enough. More than enough. Unstoppable. In the gathering darkness, mechanics were already at work on the Sherman by the Elbe, replacing a worn track, changing oil, preparing it for whatever orders might come next. The tank would run tomorrow. It would run the day after. It would run until the war was truly over and victory complete. That reliability, that steadfast mechanical persistence, was its genius. The Germans had built Tigers that could kill any tank on the battlefield. The Americans had built Shermans that would outlast any enemy and keep rolling until peace was won. History had rendered its verdict. The iron fist of democracy, wrapped in adequate armor and powered by unstoppable abundance, had crushed the defenses of tyranny through the simple, terrible arithmetic of industrial war. And in the end, that was all it needed to do.